but I know, I'm getting the staff will finish serving desserts and refill all for you some coffee or tea. But I sort of thought we might want to get going with the program. Once at a conference, David, after the first two speakers had been given 5 minutes and each one had taken 10, David made fun of the moderator, me, and said, well, every speaker talks twice as long as he thinks. Evidently, he used the male pronoun there, as he thinks he will talk. And that's a little bit worrisome for you guys, because the time for David's talk tonight is slotted at 59 minutes. If you multiply that by 2, you get 108 minutes. And if you're from the East Coast, like Captain Keller, that could be a form of water torture. Process water torture. So what I thought I would do is have us get started now. And while please keep eating and drinking coffee or other beverages, but I needed to give you just a little background on David because actually John Cobb is slated to introduce him. And we came to John and said, would you please roast David for 5 minutes? And John said, roast? This honorous class spelled Stephen T. And I do this only out of appreciation. It's definitely nothing personal at all. I have been waiting for this opportunity for 27 years. David, it's really interesting to find out what students say about you. And I actually had the excuse of tonight to ask students for their impressions of David. And there was one student who did his doctoral examination with David who said, well, actually, it was way easier than I expected. And that student shall remain unnamed, but John Sweeney then said, I was really worried that David would really latch in with his analytic rigor, but he got locked in a discussion with John Reagan for 20 minutes on the proper uses of hyphens. Gosh, so easy. Another student should remain unnamed, but she decided to mention that David's skill as a professor had a lot to do with his hot tub. David had a famous hot tub in Claremont. Actually, it's now a national landmark. And it was a large hot tub, so the entire Center for Process Studies and all the doctoral students would be invited. It's a little cozy, but that was fine. After all, it's just another form of immediacy, right? And, I wouldn't want to mention which student who talked about it, but Catherine beautifully described it as follows. She said that this time with David in the hot tub produced, quote, a good aqueous process flow. And that these evenings were characterized by, quote, a fluidity of wine and water. I don't think she was including John Cobb in that description. So I actually have to say that all of us should take a few tips from David about how to be a faculty person. Early on in David's time, I think it was in the 1980s, early 1980s, someone asked him to be interim dean for a year. That was an interesting experience. I think as a dean, one could learn something from David's approach. You see, there's been a problem with, can I tell these stories now? I guess. This is off the record, okay? There's been a problem with a librarian. I know, there's always a problem with a librarian. But there's a problem at this particular time, and there have been encounter groups and, therapy, and we've been working with this librarian. And David was made dean, and a week later, he was gone. So David had a certain, shall we say, effectiveness, a causal efficacy as a dean. And so after that point, they decided on faculty committees, they put him on the admissions committee. committee and no place else. And David, I think it's true you served more years on the music committee than any other faculty person in the history of Claremont School of Theology. Because all you can do is admit people. You see, it's not too possible. But the most important, with this I close, and turn it over to someone the evening. The most important stories are always the family stories. And so I had to collect a few family stories. And the most important one is, you know how professors are a little bit larger than life. Anne describes coming to Claremont School of Theology once, toward the end of David's career, and watching the courtyard while they stood around in this circle of adulation, you know, almost bowing down before the master as he prevaricated on this or that. And they got in the car, and I said, I feel really bad because every time you come home from Claremont, I always say, David, why didn't you take out the recycling? Spouses are the ones who bring us down to the ground. You know, David wrote 27 books before retirement, and he wrote 21 of them during the years he and Anne worked together. And at the beginning of their dating relationship, David gave Anne a manuscript and said, could you give me some feedback? I'm interested. And Anne read it, and she came back and said, have you ever heard of a thesis statement? My idea is that in any book where there's a thesis statement, we have Anne to thank. But the two stories after, I didn't interview all three of them. So, and you know, it was before David's stroke that Sarah used to say, boy, this guy's so smart, he can really afford to lose a few brain cells. I hope that wasn't prophetic. In fact, it was Allison when David was in the hospital over that summer, and the daughters came all the time to be with David during the months that he was recovering. And Anne reports that one day Allison came in. But what's really moving is the way that Allison and Sarah became really daughters to David over the years. And David said, you know, David's always been so much smarter than anyone else before, and maybe now we'll be able to catch up a little bit. But I think, David, it's moving the way that those are now your daughters and your greatest supporters. Ladies and gentlemen, we now turn to the main part of our program tonight. I'd like to call on John Cobb in just a moment to introduce David. Nobody in the role would be more appropriate to serve that function. I'd like you to take out your watches and your stopwatches. David has promised that his talk will be 59 minutes and not 1 second over. So we'll all point to our watches at 59:01. And then a little bit spontaneously, I'd like to call on Gary Dorian when David has finished to come up and just to give us a closing thought about the talk. David, Gary's not had a lot of time to prepare that, but with Gary's intelligence, that shouldn't be hard at all. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Cobb.
That's a hard act to follow, so I won't try to build on that information about David, but instead just reflect about our relationship over the years and what I have seen David doing. He was a student here, and he went off to teach. Even while he was still here as a student, he became a colleague, especially in the sense of just beginning to dream together about what we might do to make process thought a more important part of the world situation. In those days, process thought was fading in Chicago, which had been its real homeland for many years. And we were concerned that without some kind of institutionalization, it might continue simply to drift, because there were interesting process folks in various places, but there was not much holding them together or constituting a movement of any kind. And then we kept up some of this conversation later. And the two of us independently came to the idea that we should have something like a Center for Process Studies. And then, wonder of wonders, the possibility of having a Center for Process Studies developed. I was invited to return to Emory, and the lure was that I would have the minimum requirements for such a center there. And so I immediately got in touch with David again, and I suggested that he visit both Claremont and Emory, since in response to the invitation at Emory, you've heard how this thing goes. You know, in Germany, you can count how many invitations a professor has by how many institutes he has. So it's a little bit like that also in the U.S. And he visited Emory and he visited Claremont, and we finally decided that he would, since we had no desire to leave Claremont, but that would have been a very important reason for leaving, but we decided we could stay in Claremont. And so, of course, part of the arrangement to have a center was for David to come to Claremont and have a little time off from his teaching so that he could give leadership to the center. And that was for us the beginning of a new epoch in our lives. And it was remarkable, although if you know both of us, you know we are temperamentally and stylistically and in other ways somewhat different. It was amazing how quickly we could make decisions. So we didn't have to have meetings. In those days, we now have co-directors meetings, and they're very necessary, because since there were just two of us, we pass in the hall, make a suggestion, say, okay, let's do it. Then, of course, the job of doing it, we would turn over to a graduate student. There's a major exception to that, though. From a very early point, I discovered the intense workaholism and systematic planning and thinking that constituted part of David's genius. So whenever we would plan a topic, we'd plan, a year and a half ahead, let's do such and such, October a year from now. David would take that topic and read systematically until he could decide who were the people who we most wanted to have at that meeting. And then he would, since many of the people we wanted to have at the meeting didn't really know anything about writing, we just judged that that thought lent itself to connecting with our interests and so forth. He would write a paper. I told you at one of our sessions about one of them. Usually these papers were manageable length and actually provided enough knowledge on their part of what we were interested in to have a positive effect on the conversation. A few of you were not there, so I'll say again, on one occasion, we were honoring Charles Birch, who was an ecological scholar in Australia, very active in the World Council of Churches, and a very committed process thinker. And we asked him what would he like to have a conference on. And, well, it turned out it was really the relation of mind and body that was the central thing he felt was needed at that juncture. So David started to write his 20-page paper, and I think I told you it became 350 pages, and nobody read it, and the conference was pretty miserable. So he just published his little essay as an important book with the University of California Press. So if you can't get your colleagues at the conference to do their homework, give it to the world. Now David was quite busy in Claremont with his teaching and with his leadership in the Center for Process Studies and writing books. But that really wasn't enough to take care of his town. So he moved to Santa Barbara and created a whole new institute there. And he had a series of conferences in Santa Barbara that were oriented to the general cultured public rather than to academia. And that was a quite impressive series of events that took place there. I think he considered them as having a relationship to the center, but he did all the work himself because the center staff was involved in those activities. And then they morphed into a series of something like 30 volumes. That may be how many whatever in your series soon impressed me. Which and of course that was totally in addition. I mean, he was editing all those volumes while he was continuing to write his own books. Now, I think this is extremely impressive, but I see Gary Dorian at our table, and Gary would say, well, that might take me 2 or 3 days. Well, all of this is to say, being a colleague of David, and I don't mean just in the School of Theology, but in working together at the center was an extremely rewarding part of my life. And even then, I was exceedingly impressed by the amount that he produced. One of the differences between us is that he is a scholar. I often use the word scholar in a somewhat derogatory way. That's because I think so many people are scholars for the sake of scholarship. But in David's case, his scholarship was devoted to what I think we can call the job of trying to make some contribution to preventing the world from destroying itself. If I put it in a positive way, I think our goal is to save the world. We are both missionaries and ministers, and maybe our self-understanding of what we're called to do is a little different from other people who are also ordained to be ministers, but I think it's continuous, and it's a needed part of the future. You also learned a little bit today about, very late in David's career, a Chinese student showed up, who we were very pleased to have, and he turned out, we gradually discovered, to be the leading postmodernist in China. He was also in the rather influential position of being responsible for all the publications of the National Academy of Social Science. And the social science in China includes philosophy. And so he knew people all over China, was highly respected, and we suddenly discovered that we had, as a graduate student, a truly brilliant leader. I'm not saying this over against being a student, but most students cannot redirect another nation while they're graduates. I think at the time that David retired, I made a statement. If he had been my only student, my career would have still been very strong. I heard him say, he would say the same thing about Cobb, and I think with very good reason. I think to transform China is enough of an achievement. Well, I think that you can understand that our collegiality has also been a matter of deep importance for us personally as friends. So I want to introduce to you my very dear friend and much admired colleague, David Griffin. start until they bring something. Thank you, John. Very good. He did say, he would have said the same thing about he would say the same thing after. In fact, he did on many occasions. To Philip, thank you for the introduction. Particularly, thank you for dressing up so well that you make me look like a slob. But most of all, thank you for granting me 108 minutes tonight. And regarding Anne's story about Theseus' name, storm, it was true. And ever since I learned that, I've read real good. Having never considered the idea of writing an autobiography, I had never even thought about how I would structure an hour-long summary of my intellectual life. But as I started jotting down ideas, I decided to explain how my intellectual journey was influenced by various external events. With regard to my high school life, one incident stands out. Church was always an important factor in my life, and the youth group of my church devoted a big part of my social life. I served as its president during my final 2 years of high school. But I did not think of making the church my life's work, at least not immediately. And the summer before my first year of college, I asked my girlfriend, whom I assumed I would whether it would be okay with her if I were to go into ministry when I was 40 years old. After my life was essentially over. I started college as an English major, but I soon changed my plans for several reasons, including my first and only fraternity party. It was truly gross. This was the University of Oregon, mind you, where Animal House was filmed. That party evoked in me one of those there must be a more to life type of experiences. Later than that night, I told my roommate that I was going to go into either psychology or ministry. So the next 2 terms, I signed up for psychology classes and a class across the street at Christian College, a Bible college of my own denomination, as I was a freshman. The following year, wanting to test out the idea of going into the ministry, I transferred over to NCC, and I ended up going there for 4 years.
experience meant that when I came to seminary in graduate school, I seemed to value the classes there more highly than the students who had gone to secondary university. My favorite classes at NCC have been in pastoral counseling. I was considered going into this. However, instead of leaving for seminary right after college, I needed to wait a year because my fiance was already committed to go on a college tour. So I went back across the university to get a master's degree in counseling. So my plans were changed by 2 visits to California. Having read some of Paul Tillich's sermons, I learned that he was going to give the early lectures at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley. My fiance and I, along with our best friends, drove down to attend the lectures. Tillich was magnificent. Between his books and his lectures, I started telling my friends that I was going into philosophical theology, which is introduced the query, what's that? Having made this decision, the next question was, where should I go? PSR had a professor who taught Tillich, so this seemed a natural choice. But a preacher in Eastern Oregon told me that while Harvard College, this is how life-determining events are determined, that Yale was the best school. So I applied to these 2 schools and got accepted by both. PSR even gave me the entrance scholarship, which was worth $1,000, which in today's terms would amount to real money. I had a terrible time deciding between them, and I eventually decided on PSR. I was very relieved to have that choice behind me. But almost the next day, I was invited into the office of John Boothing, NCC's one liberal professor, who showed me the catalog from a school of theology at some place called Claremont. It had never been mentioned by any of my other professors at that school. Even though the School of Theology at Claremont was an official seminary of the same denomination. In any case, although I told Boothing I was not interested, I had made my decision. He encouraged me to take the catalog. The next day I called my parents, telling them that the catalog made the school look a lot more exciting than either PSR or Yale. But I didn't think I should make such a big decision on the basis of a good catalog. They agreed, and I planned to fly down to Southern California the following week. However, the morning I was planning to leave, I told George Norgela, who was in a class at the University of Oregon on various religious matters with me, that I was going. George, who had studied Whitehead and Hartshorn at Phillips Seminary in Oklahoma, got very excited, saying that if I would drive down, he would come with me. I agreed, and we drove down along with a couple of my friends who were very anxious to see some sun. While we were there, George arranged to meet a professor I otherwise might not have met, Dr. John B. Cobb, Jr. In response to George's question whether he had written anything recently, Dr. Cobb gave him a little paper entitled A Personal Response. At that point, I had decided that although I liked Cobb and the other professors I met, I would stick with PSI. But on the trip home, when it was my turn to sit in the back seat, I picked up Cobb's little paper, and after reading only 4 or 5 pages, I decided I would go to Clayton. I saw that Cobb was not only dealing with the kinds of questions I had been struggling with, but also that he was dealing with them with clarity. A book on philosophical theology I had read by one theologian was so unclear I had thrown it across the room. So I was set to study philosophical theology with John. However, my decision to focus on philosophical theology was not as final as I had thought. After a friend and I heard Aldous Huxley lecture at the University of Oregon on the doors of perfection, My friend sent to Texas for some peyote. Having ground it up in my blender and put it in some Kool-Aid, no one told me to squeeze out the mescaline. I had to throw up. But I then had a very interesting thought. Huxley said that under mescaline, he had stared at a rose for over an hour. I thought, come on, Alice, maybe 5 minutes, but not an hour. Soon after throwing up, I walked across the street and stared at a 24-hour Martinizing sign for an hour. Drinking the Kool-Aid. Although I did not ingest many more such things, I did become increasingly interested in mystical literature. This path was influenced by an unusual philosophy professor at the university who told us about the blind Father Joseph of Cupertino, about which the professor pointed out there was an article in the Journal of Psychical Research. Having moved to a new residence at the beginning of the 1963 summer, I had gotten married. I discovered that only a block away there was a library of the Theosophical Society. Besides having the American and British Journals of Psychical Research, this library had many fascinating books, including one about Edgar Casey. He gave people readings in which he and trance reportedly told them various things about themselves that he should not have known, even where in a local drugstore they could find heated medicines. The mystical literature in the Theosophical Library, heavily influenced by Hindu and Buddhist ideas, led me to think that perhaps I should focus on those religions while I was at class. As fate or God would have it, the class in Eastern religions that I had to take was scheduled at the same time as a seminar by Dr. Cobb called Whitehead's Philosophy and its Religious Relevance. I soon found myself skipping out of the Eastern religions class to attend Cobb's seminar. I still remember a simile he used in opposing the traditional view of divine action, according to which God miraculously intervenes here and there. Much liberal theology seems to assume, God said, that the only alternative is to think of God as acting like a cosmic hydraulic jack, exerting the same pressure always and everywhere. Cobb thereby implied that Whitehead provided a third view. This and other suggestions made me anxious to learn more about Whiteheadian thought. During my first 2 years at Claremont, I read some books by Charles Hartthorne, who had been Whitehead's assistant, and later years was Cobb's professor at the University of Chicago. However, I spent most of my time learning German and studying for several entrance exams. One of these was over my dissertation proposal, which was to develop a process for scholarship. After completing these exams, I would be ready to study with Cobb, along with New Testament scholar and theologian James Robinson, who was the leader of the new quest for the historical Jesus, which I had planned to make central to my dissertation. However, Cobb and Robinson, I learned, were both to be away in the following year. With little reason to remain in Claremont, and having learned that our best friends were planning to go to Germany for that year, my wife and I decided to go with them. It turned out that they were unable to go, but my wife and I went anyway, partly because we realized that Cobb would be at the University of Mainz with Wolfhard Honenberg, who was to be the subject of the third volume of a series edited by Cobb and Robinson called New Frontiers in Theology. My year in Mainz where I heard Pannenberg's lectures and participated in his seminars, was extremely valuable. Pannenberg was a brilliant lecturer who, unlike my professors in Claremont, simply announced the truth on issue after issue. This style forced me, especially when I disagreed with him, to start a notebook in which I worked out my own ideas. Insofar as I disagreed with Pannenberg, I had to ask why. That was when I started becoming a theologian. While being appreciative of Whitehead, Pannenberg was working out a different type of process theology, one based more on Hegel. The contrast was made clearest with his provocative notion of the retroactive effect of the future on the past. The provocative nature of this notion was most important with respect to the doctrine of the resurrection of Jesus. This doctrine, said Pannenberg, will be true if, and only if, there is an end of history containing a general resurrection of the dead. This future event will make it true that Jesus had been, in first century Palestine, raised from the dead. This was an example of what Pannenberg called the backward working or retroactive effect of the future on the past. Coming out of a lecture one day, I overheard a student say, Pannenberg's entire theology is based on a notion that God needs stimmt. That is absolutely not true, because the future cannot affect the past. What the student evidently did not understand was that Pannenberg presupposed Hegel's absolute idealism, according to which no historical events are settled until history has reached its goal. Analogously, there is no time as we normally understand it within a single Whiteheadian actual entity or actual occasion. Rather, each actual occasion is a self-determining whole, so that nothing is finally settled until the occasion reaches satisfaction. But time exists in history because of the transition from past actual occasions to subsequent actual occasions. And there are many occasions in each time. Whitehead's type of thought, he said, involved a transformation of some main doctrines of absolute idealism onto a realistic basis. I later did receive confirmation with Pannenberg that he regarded the whole universe as like a single Whiteheadian actual entity. I also became critical of Pannenberg for another reason. After Cobb arrived in Mainz, he and Pannenberg had private discussions once a week, marveling at the comprehensiveness of Pannenberg's thought. Cobb told me after several weeks that he had not yet brought up an issue that Pannenberg had not already worked out. But in a seminar one day, one student, taking note of Pannenberg's definition of God as the power over everything, asked how that view of God fit with the reality of evil. Pannenberg started explaining that God gave human beings freedom and that terrible things happen because of the sinful misuse of that freedom. But, the student said, he was not thinking about Böse, sin, but about evil, which means includes natural evil. Given this clarification, Pannenberg replied that he had not yet dealt with this issue. I could hardly believe my ears. It seemed to me that theologians should not deal with anything else before working out their positions on the relations of God to evil, especially natural evil. One of the benefits of my year in Germany was that it cured me of a common malady among American theologians, having an inferiority complex in relation to Germans. Another benefit was due to the fact that Cobb and Pannenberg co-taught a seminar on Hegel, Teilhard, and Whitehead. While studying for this course, I finally came to understand Whitehead's philosophy. However, my self-congratulation was premature. For it was really only after I had come back to Claremont that I, for the first time, came to understand Whitehead's philosophy. This understanding came about through three means. Because one was that I became Cobb's assistant to help him with his publication. Second, I took Cobb's Whitehead class. Third, I employed Whitehead in my dissertation, especially the chapter that had already become my first published article, Schubert and Christology and the possibility of process philosophy. The unhappiest feature of my time in Claremont was that it was bookended by political assassination. I had been in Claremont only 2 months, when one day, upon returning to the School of Theology campus, a fellow said, "The president has been shot." I exclaimed, "Why would anyone have shot President Cobb?" I was assuming, of course, that the reference was to Ernst Cobb, the first president of Claremont School of Theology, who had brought Cobb and Robinson to Claremont from Emory. Learning that it was President Kennedy, I was in a daze the rest of the week. And the assassination shaped the rest of my time in Claremont. In 1967, my best friend, who had been my best friend at NCC, who had come down to Claremont at the same time as I, started coming over every week to watch a TV show in which Mortzall and others discussed the war reports live. And then in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in April, and then in June, as I was getting ready to defend my dissertation, I learned of the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, whose progression through the presidential primary contest I had been following intensely. Like many other people, I was hoping for a president who would bring the end to America's barbaric war in Vietnam, in which my then wife's brother was to die in one of those stupid search and destroy missions. Seeing how the government lied about all three assassinations, and how the press helped the government with its cover-ups. This helped me several decades later to deal with the way Finn understand how Finn was a 9/11 crime and was covered up by the press. After completing my dissertation, I took a position in the theology department at the University of Dayton, a Roman Catholic school. Besides teaching required classes, I was able to teach Whitehead for honor students. And it was by actually teaching Whitehead philosophy that I came really for the first time to understand this philosophy. Soon after coming to Dayton, I met Jean Reeves, who was living in Yellow Springs, about 20 miles away. Knowing that Cobb and Lewis Ford were planning a journal called Process Studies, we produced the first fairly complete bibliography of secondary literature on Whitehead. Through that work, which consumed hundreds of hours over a couple of years, I developed an awareness of the extensiveness of the articles, books, and reviews that discussed or employed Whitehead's thought. We relocated over 1,900 of them. I had another project with a more senior author, the death of God theologian Thomas Altheiser. Cobb, considering the thought of Altheiser very important, had co-edited the book on his theology. Thinking that Cobb's theology was equally important, Altheiser and I decided to co-edit the book on his theology. which we called, with a double entendre, if not originality, John Cobb's Theology in Christ. Considering Cobb's two most important essays until then to be From Crisis Theology to Postmodern World and Christian Natural Theology and Christian Existence, I entitled my introduction to the volume Postmodern Theology for a New Christian Existence. This was my first use of the term postmodern, which I would later come to employ ad nauseum. During that Daytonian period, I wrote a faithful letter to Cobb. I outlined some ideas I had developed for an Institute of Whitehead Stories, after which I asked Cobb if he had ever thought of such a thing. Now, of course, John Cobb just told this story, but just forget what he said. He got it wrong. Because this happened not when I was still a parent, but it's when I was at the UC Davis. Cobb wrote back immediately saying that he had been thinking about almost exactly the same thing. We both wondered, of course, if such a dream was realistic. But shortly thereafter, Cobb was invited to give lectures at the Canberra School of Theology at Emory University. And the dean, James Lane, asked Cobb what it would take to bring him there. Cobb replied, an Institute of Whitehead Studies. Asked by Lane how much this would require, Cobb replied that I had said we would need $100,000 a year, but the Cobb thought we could get by with something less. Laney said, I'll get it. Nothing happened immediately, but the following year, Cobb wrote that Laney had come up with $5,200. And I asked if I considered that enough. Although this was only about half as much as I considered necessary, I was very tired of Ohio. And I also knew that returning to Claremont would open up opportunities that would never have been possible at Davis. I was invited for a visit at Canberra. All went well, and Laney sent a contract to Cobb, who was on sabbatical in Hawaii. But Cobb received a note from Claremont saying, don't sign anything. We're working on a plan to keep you here. Pretty soon I received an invitation to come to Claremont to interview. Fortunately, there would be a position for me. Professor of Philosophy and Religion was only 1 year away from retirement. Some of the faculty were less than enthusiastic about my coming, because I had performed less than brilliantly in some of their classes. having worked hard only on topics that were central to my project. But this obstacle was overcome by the fact that as soon as I had completed my dissertation, I began publishing. Besides turning my dissertation into a book, I had published a dozen journal articles. Tom Trotter, then the dean of the School of Theology, told me that after he handed out my bibliography, there was no more grumbling. One of the greatest stimuli for my intellectual development was my work at the Center for Philosophy Study, which is what we decided to call our Institute for Whitehead Study. The school allowed me to teach only half-time, so that I would have time to work for this work, which primarily involved, besides supervising the center staff, organizing conferences and then sometimes arranging publication of papers. Our first conference, which was on evolutionary theory, had been arranged by Cobb and Australian biologist Charles Birch to take place at the Rockefeller Foundation Study and Conference Center in Bellagio. This conference gave me the opportunity to participate in discussions involving biologists who had helped create neo-Darwinism, such as Theo Wright and Theodosius Dolzhensky, philosophers such as Charles Hartshorne, Millis Chapek, and Arthur Hirschfeld, and the physicist David Baldwin. This conference resulted in the Center's first book, Mind in Nature, Essay from the Interface of Science and Philosophy, which I co-edited with Cobb. Thanks to our trip to Italy, Cobb and I published another book at about the same time. Prior to the Bellagio conference, Cobb had been contacted by an Italian publisher about writing a book explaining process theology. Cobb told me that he could do it only if I co-authored the book and, in fact, outlined it. Telling him that I also did not have time, I was starting my theology book, I said I would meet with the publisher following the Bellagio conference, and after confirming our suspicion that his publishing house was quite minor, I would suggest an alternative. I discovered, however, that his house was Italy's major publisher of American and European theological books. I still suggested, nevertheless, that because most of his readers would be Catholic, he should get Bernard Lee to write the book. The publisher, however, said that he wanted Clermont Bols's theology. So I agreed that we would squeeze it in. Working out an outline on the flight home, I assigned the first 4 chapters to myself and the last 5 to Cobb. After writing my first 4 chapters in 2 weeks, Cobb, having gone by himself to his cabin in Wrightwood, where he worked 20 hours a week, wrote his 5 chapters in a week. But each of his chapters were primarily exposition of the thought of other process theologians, after which Cobb allowed that he too had some ideas about the topic. Having assumed that he would simply summarize the books that he had written on these topics, I reminded Cobb that the Italian publisher wanted Clermont Bols's theology. So he went back to Wrightwood, and in another week came back with a new version of those 5 chapters. When I ran into Jean Cobb in the library where she was working, she said, "Now don't you make John rewrite those chapters again." I found this quite humorous. Only a few years earlier, I had been Cobb's student assistant. And here was his wife suggesting that I could have ordered him to write. I was able that same year, 1976, to do what I had vowed to do as soon as I had turned my dissertation into a book, write a book on the problem of evil. In God, Power, and Evil, I showed that Whitehead's philosophy provided the basis for an approach that had been scarcely noticed in the mainline discussions of the problem of evil, which had endlessly debated the relative merits of atheism and traditional theism. At the same time, I began working with still another senior scholar, Vanderbilt philosopher Donald Sherburne, on the corrected edition of Whitehead's Process and Reality. By editing this book, I rather belatedly learned the English language. We will not be the staples. Whitehead was big on those. The next phase of my intellectual development occurred in the 1980-81 year. The previous year had been the worst one of my academic life, because the president had asked me, that is, ordered me to serve as the acting dean, while Dean Joseph Tuck was on sabbatical for a year in Cambridge. That entire year, I got only one essay written, which I was able to do only thanks to a long weekend in Santa Barbara. Because of the terrible year the president had inflicted on me, he allowed me to extend my sabbatical half-year leave into a full year. And so, having learned from Joe how wonderful Cambridge was, I went there. I had 2 topics to work on. First, having learned from a literary friend that postmodernism was becoming quite important in her field, I wanted to study the origins of distinctively modern thought, so as to understand what distinctively postmodern thought would be. Second, having been invited to make a presentation to the Cambridge University's Theology Society, I gave a critique of John Hick's much-discussed book, The Myth of God Incarnate. In this critique, I explained how I, as a process theologian, use the mind-body relation as an analogy for understanding the interaction between God and the world. Afterwards, a philosopher told me that philosophers and neuroscientists no longer think of the mind as distinct from the brain, but instead hold a position called identism, according to which the mind is identical with the brain. The mind and the brain are not two distinct things, and hence could not connect. I began reading around to see if there really was good evidence for identism, a study that would eventuate almost 2 decades later in my unsmiling The World Around, Consciousness, Freedom, and Mind-Body Love, in which I showed how Whitehead's philosophy provides for a solution to the mind-body problem that had scarcely been noticed in the mainline discussion, in which the relative merit of dualism and materialism had been endlessly debated. Near the end of my semester at Cambridge, I decided to spend the second half of my sabbatical in Berkeley, partly because it would be warmer, but mainly because it was the location of a first-rate physicist named Henry Stapp, who had been influenced by Whitehead. I learned about Stapp through a 1979 book called The Dancing Wuling Master, about which I was told by David Bowman, whom I had gone to London to visit. Shortly before ending my tenure at Cambridge, I found in the library a book on the mind-body problem by a Scottish philosopher who argued that, although the evidence can be seen as supporting either mind-brain identism or the contrary view, the evidence from psychical research tips the balance in favor of the view that the mind is different from the brain. This Scottish philosopher assumed that the rejection of identism entails acceptance of mind-brain dualism, in the view that the mind and the brain are different kinds. The mind is a mental or spiritual substance, while the brain is composed of physical stuff. Although I, as a Whiteheadian, rejected this kind of dualism, which has never been able to explain how, apart from miraculous intervention, the mind and the brain can interact, I was intrigued by the fact that a sophisticated philosopher was appealing to psychical research, a subject I had left behind almost 2 decades earlier. When I got to Berkeley, I began studying physics and biology during the day, while in the evening reading books on psychical research, I then generally called parapsychology. I soon decided, however, that in addition to the fact that parapsychology had been less milked than physics and biology for philosophical and theological purposes, it was also, in some respects, more important. Through this study, I greatly expanded my appreciation of the senses in which Whitehead's philosophy was postmodern. Whitehead not only said that telepathy provides empirical evidence in favor of influence at a distance, which I learned was the idea that had been most severely scorned by distinctively modern philosophers such as Descartes and Newton. Whitehead also said that his philosophy allows for the possibility of life after death. Readings in parapsychology came to fill most of my days as well as my evenings. When I returned to Claremont, where I had been asked to give a lecture at the Center for Process Study annual Banquet, I spoke on parapsychology and the need for a postmodern philosophy, which Joe Huff called my talk on the spook world. 2 years later, having moved to Santa Barbara to escape Claremont's smog, which was quite bad in those days, I started the Center for the Postmodern World in Santa Barbara along with Annie and Jacquet, who was soon to become my wife. This was to be a community-based rather than an academy-based center. Only a couple years later, the relationships Cobb and I had established with Bone and staff led to a conference in Claremont on the relation of physics to time, which featured, in addition to Bone and staff, also Yulia Prigogine, Nobel Prize-winning chemist. In a visit with Bone and Ojai at the Krishnamurti Foundation, which kept a permanent apartment for him there, I suggested that the conference be called Physics and the Ultimate Significance of Time, Bone, Prigogine, and Process Philosophy, and he readily agreed. My discussion of Prigogine and the introduction to the resulting volume was greatly aided by a visit I had while in Paris with Isabel Stenger, the co-author of Prigogine's most well-known book, Order Out of Chaos. And she has since become one of Europe's most respected philosophers of science and interpreters of Whitehead, relating him to leading European philosophers. It was while writing this introduction to the volume that I came to the fullest appreciation I had of the appropriateness of the term process philosophy for Whitehead's mind. Most science-based philosophy argues that time, with its distinction between the past and the present, is not rooted in basic physics. That time only becomes real when the universe develops processes that could suffer entropic decay. If there were nothing but simple, enduring objects such as electrons and photons, this view holds, there would be no time. For Whitehead, however, each of these enduring objects is constituted by a rapidly repeating series of momentary events, of electronic or photonic events. Each such momentary event hence inherits from the previous event and influences future events. Accordingly, time as we experience, with its irreversible direction from the past to the future, exists for electrons and photons, even quarks. It was also by writing this introduction that I came to a full appreciation of Whitehead's doctrine that the things that are actual entities in the fullest sense of actual are momentary events, whereas things that endure are societies of actual entities. They are, to be sure, not scientists or scientists that we normally think of. They are societies that are purely temporal, having only one member at a time. I was able to get this book, Physics and the Ultimate Significance of Time, published by SUNY Press, which luckily was headed by William P. Eastman, who had studied with Charles Hartzell. The following year, moreover, Eastman accepted my proposal for a book series called the SUNY Series in Constructive Postmodern Thought. During its existence from 1988 to 2004, this series published 31 volumes, 10 of which I wrote or edited. Obviously, John and I didn't coordinate the discussions here, but I'm repeating some points that he made. The first two volumes, entitled The Re-Enchantment of Science and Spirituality in Society, arose out of the Santa Barbara Center's first conference. These books illustrated the purpose of that center, providing a new vision of the world and also prescriptions for changing the world. Although process philosophy remained at the core, we brought in many people who, while sharing our values, were not necessarily card-carrying Whiteheadians, such as Richard Falk, Joanna Mason, Brian Smith, and Rupert Shelby. These two edited volumes created considerable interest in China, and shortly thereafter, Zhu Wong came to Claremont to get his PhD under me and to establish, with his wife, May June, who already had her PhD, the China project of the Center for Process Study, and later the Institute for Postmodern Development of China. Thanks to their indefatigable energy, including their supervision of the translation of many of our books into Chinese, process philosophy, under the title of constructive postmodernism, is now as important in China as the deconstructive type of postmodernism. John Cobb and I have become much better known in China than we are in America. At that first Men of Art conference, I met Richard Fall and Charlene Spratt. The three of us, together with postmodern architect Charles James, established a postmodern gang of four, which started holding conferences in California and Scotland. In one of the conferences in Scotland, we focused on global politics, at which Rolf made a presentation on global anarchy, meaning a situation in which there is no global authority by which disputes between states can be peacefully settled. For many years, I've been trying to develop a post-nuclear theology aimed at finding a way to eliminate nuclear weapons. There were three main positions. Some people advocated nuclear pacifism, according to which nuclear weapons would be ruled out. But I could see no way in which a system allowing for war in general could rule out nuclear war. A second position was complete pacifism. But I agreed with Reinhold Niebuhr's argument that it would be unworkable. The third position was Niebuhr's, according to which there was no way to get rid of nuclear weapons. We would have to continue living with nuclear weapons. We would have to continue relying on mutual deterrence, hoping that it would hold up indefinitely. But I agreed with pacifists that the reliance on mutual deterrence to prevent the first use of nuclear weapons was unchristian, immoral by any ethical standard, and too risky. Explaining in several chapters of a projected book why each of these three approaches was inadequate, I assumed that in this process an answer would emerge, but it did not. So in the mid-1980s, I simply put those chapters away and began focusing on other aspects of a postmodern worldview and world order. Falk's discussion of global anarchy, however, implied that there might be a fourth approach, one that was suggested in two books that I had taken with me for 5 weeks of study at Bellagio: The Parable of the Tribes by Andrew Mark Schmuckler, and The Pursuit of Power by University of Chicago history professor Clayton. This fourth approach had actually been suggested by several thinkers, including Einstein. The idea that war could be outlawed and rendered unnecessary by the development of a global government, a government that could be made just by instituting democracy and ruling out any influence of money. The feature that has increasingly destroyed American democracy by turning it into plutocracy. After my time at Bellagio was up, Ann and I had planned to go to one of the Greek islands. But which one? Because the idea of global democracy had hit me with the force of revelation, I suggested that we should go to the Isle of Patmos, where there was some precedent for writing down revelation. Realizing that global democracy would probably be the only way to overcome the ecological crisis as well as war, I started, upon returning to Claremont, teaching a graduate seminar called Theology, Ecology, and Peace, which was, as Joe Huff correctly stated, Griffin's course on global democracy. At first, the students were extremely skeptical. One student even admitted during a class party at the end of the semester that for the first few weeks he had thought I must be crazy. But as the students worked through the readings, they came to believe that without the emergence of a global democratic structure, there was no hope for overcoming plutocracy, war, and the nuclear and ecological crisis. During the final decade of the 20th century and the first part of the next decade, I taught this course every other year, coming closer each time to completing a book manuscript on global democracy. At At the same time, recognizing that global democracy would require a universal Bill of Rights, I began working on this issue, challenging the assumption that culture had such different moral standards that a global ethic sufficient to ground a universally acceptable Bill of Rights would be impossible. In relation to a conference at a law school that a professor there and I were called help had organized, I wrote a quite long paper that was only one draft away from being publishable as a thin book. Closely related to the question of the global ethic is, of course, the issue of universalism and pluralism in the various religions. In my 2001 book, Re-Enchantment Without Supernatural, I had a chapter entitled The Two Ultimates and Religions, in which I built on Cobb's writings on religious pluralism. The occasion for a further treatment of this issue came when, on the occasion of the retirement of Marjorie Hopkins from her position as the academic dean of the Claremont School of Theology, I volunteered to organize a center organized in her honor on religious pluralism, which had become Marjorie's greatest passion. Writing introductory chapters for the resulting book, I gave a threefold argument. First, although John Hick had provided the best-known type of religious pluralism, this type led many theologians and religious philosophers to say that religious pluralism should be rejected. Second, Cobb's type has none of the problems in Hick's position that led religious pluralism into ill repute. Third, although it was wrong to say, as did several critics, that Hick's position was not really pluralism, his pluralism is shallow compared with Cobb's. Accordingly, I, with the aid of the participants in the conference, named the resulting book, Deep Religious Pluralism. This period, during which I was working on global democracy, global morality, and religious pluralism, was also the period in which I wrote 4 science-based books. In addition to Unsnarling the World Knot, I also, having written a major paper on parapsychology for a conference in Santa Barbara I had planned with Ethel and founder Michael Murphy, wrote a book called Parapsychology, Philosophy, and Religion, arguing that Whitehead's philosophy allows for the possibilities of the 3 major subjects of parapsychology: telepathy, psychokinesis, not kinesis, and phenomena, suggestion. I also wrote Religion and Scientific Naturalism, in which I pointed out that atheism and supernaturalistic theism do not exhaust the options. There is also naturalistic theism, of which Whitehead is arguably the outstanding example. In this book's longest chapter, which deals with evolution, I argue that Whitehead's philosophy, you guessed it, provides an alternative beyond the standard alternative of neo-Darwinism and intelligent design. Finally, this same period brought forth my most extensive treatment of philosophy of religion, Re-Enchantment Without Supernaturalism, in which I argued that Whitehead's philosophy provides the basis for a response to Max Weber's disenchantment thesis, according to which modernity has permanently destroyed the idea that philosophy can provide the basis for a public morality. To return to my developing manuscript on global democracy, although it was 3/4 written by the beginning of the 21st century, a funny thing happened on my way to completion. Actually, 2 things. The first thing was 9/11. Accepting the standard liberal interpretation, I regarded the 9/11 attack as vengeance by Muslims on America for its imperialist foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. But although American imperialism played a central role in every chapter of my intended book, I had not thematized U.S. imperialism as such, so I set out to correct this oversight by writing a chapter on it. But as a colleague once said, once you get into American imperialism, you find there's no end to it. Certainly not a short end. So my intended chapter on American imperialism soon became my intended book, after which I would write a summary to serve as a chapter in my global democracy. By the beginning of 2003, I had my intended book on American imperialism about 3/4 finished. But at that point, the second funny thing happened. I became aware of evidence that 9/11 was an inside job. I've been told about some of this evidence by a visiting scholar a few months earlier, but after looking at the suggested website, I found it unconvincing and went back to my work on American imperialism. However, early in 2003, I became aware of a website and a few books that presented a much stronger case. I decided that if this was true, it was of utmost importance, not only to the questions of war and ecological survival, but also to theology. So I needed to drop other matters long enough to determine whether it was true. Shortly after the Iraq War study, I was asked by School of Theology students to speak about this Iraq War. I used this invitation to speak not about the Iraq War as such, but only about 9/11 as the precondition for that war. Afterwards, I decided I should turn my outline into an article, perhaps to be sent to Harvard. But as before, my intended essay soon became a proposed book, which I decided to call The New Heart. As for publishing it, I assumed that this would be no problem, given the fact that I had already published over 20 books. I quickly found, however, that publishers would not answer my letters, even if Richard Fall would tell them, friends of his, that he recommended that they look at it. I did get a response from one publishing house called Common Courage, which gave me a 3-word email, not for us. At least this publisher, I told Anne, was not guilty of false advertising because it was not called Uncommon Courage. Thanks to Richard, however, I finally found a publisher. Being aware that he had published a little book on the U.S. war in Afghanistan, I asked him while we were at dinner one time whether this book's publisher might take mine. Saying it was worth a try, Richard gave me the email address of Anne, the editor, and soon after began it. She later revealed how this decision came about, a revelation relevant to the oft-asked question whether my being a theologian had helped or hurt my 9/11 work. Anne had felt torn. On the one hand, Richard had told her that I was sensible and my book was well written. On the other hand, she said to herself, Griffin was a conspiracy theorist. So she called her father, a Presbyterian clergyman, and asked whether he had ever heard of a theologian named David Ray Griffin. David Ray Griffin, her dad explained. I have all his books. So, my being a theologian has helped me more than it has hurt. Because apart from being a theologian, I might never have gotten my first book published. Another question I've often been asked is how, given my background, I started writing about 9/11. A question often meaning, what is a nice theologian like you dealing with an issue like this? I answered, if 9/11, in which American political and military leaders arguably orchestrated 9/11 as a pretext to attack Islamic countries, to give even more money to the already bloated military budget, and to further enrich the 1%, is not a theological issue for those who see themselves as standing in the tradition of Amos, Isaiah, and Jesus, and what would be a theological issue. Sometimes the question has been stated with a more hostile meaning. How could you, being a theologian, possibly have anything relevant to say about 9/11? I answered that my education at Claremont and my writing during my teaching years dealt with history, religion, theology, philosophy, science, and global politics. And a background in those fields was exactly what was needed to deal with the various aspects of 9/11. For example, my work in the philosophy of science gave me much of the background I needed to deal with the destruction of the World Trade Center. I even employed Whitehead in my book on the destruction of the World Trade Center. In addition, my extensive treatment of evil helped me to avoid the fallacy that has led many Americans to refuse to look at evidence about 9/11 as being the inside job. The belief that American political and military leaders simply would not have done such a heinous thing. My interruption to work on 9/11, interruption that has resulted in 11 books and 65 articles on 9/11, has certainly prevented me from doing many things I had planned. I now hope, besides completing the still unfinished books on American imperialism, global democracy, and ethics, to write a systematic theology. Back when I was a graduate student, I asked John Cobb when he was going to write his systematic theology. He replied that this would have to wait until he retired. Some years after he had retired, he said to me, "Do you remember when you asked me when I would write my systematic theology?" And I said, after I had retired. Now my answer is, never. He gave several reasons to justify this decision, but I did not accept these reasons. In any case, I plan to write my own systematic theology. Indeed, when I said that a conference or volume should not be planned until I had done something worthy of his honor, I primarily had in mind a systematic theology. Because of my close brush with death, I did accept the idea of the present conference, even though I had not even started my systematic theology. But I still plan to do it, God and my heart doctor willing. I also hope to write some other books that I've had in mind for some time. One of those would be called America, Divine or Demonic. Another book, replying to the growing number of books advocating the so-called new atheism, would be called God Does Not Exist, but God Does. We are following the terminology employed by a conservative British philosopher who, during the debate, asked, "Are you referring to God or God?" Employing God to mean the deity of Augustine, Thomas, and Calvin, I will explain that virtually all arguments for atheism point out that there are many reasons to deny the existence of God. Whereas God, as portrayed in process philosophy, is supported by many strong considerations. Let me conclude by saying this. Like people who have received the Nobel Peace Prize on the assumption that they will sometime do something to be worthy of it, I thank you for participating in this conference, celebrating the worthy work that I plan to do.